Today, we are taking a look at 4 of the craziest true crime stories ever shared on the Joe Rogan Experience Podcast. We will hear the stories, and then we will go into detail about each true crime case. Starting with the JRE MMA show number 150 with Daniel Cormier. Now, Daniel and Joe Rogan talk about the dating game killer. Before we hear Daniel and Joe discuss the dating game killer, let's real quickly take a look at who the dating game killer was. The dating game killer's real name is Rodney Alcala, and Rodney was born in August of 1943 in San Antonio, Texas. When Rodney was just a child, his father abandoned the family, and not long after, his mother moved him and his siblings to Los Angeles, California. When Rodney was 17 years old, he joined the US Army. But while in the army, he suffered a nervous breakdown and was diagnosed with antisocial personality disorder before being discharged. After being discharged from the army, Randy enrolled in UCLA's School of Fine Arts. Now, on paper, Rodney was very impressive. He was intelligent, he was said to have an IQ of around 130, he was charismatic and also creative. According to classmates, Rodney, he spoke well, he dressed well, and he just gave off that vibe of someone who had it all together. But inside, Rodney was hiding something dark. Something really dark. He had a really strange obsession with photography. He'd carry a camera around and offer to take pictures of women and children, telling them that he was building up his portfolio. But that wasn't the real reason why he was taking photos. Fast forwarding a bit to when Rodney's crimes first came to light. At the time, Rodney was living in Los Angeles, working as a typesetter and building up a reputation as an amateur photographer. One day in 1968, Rodney spotted an 8-year-old girl named Tali Shapiro walking to school. Rodney in his car pulled up next to her and lured her into his car. Now, thankfully, there was a car behind Rodney that saw this whole entire interaction go down. The man in the car was suspicious because he had just seen a grown man picking up a little girl who clearly wasn't his kid. So this man in the car followed Rodney to his apartment and watched Rodney take the girl into his apartment. The man in the car immediately called the police. When officers arrived at the apartment, they knocked on the door, but there was no response. So the officers forced their way into the apartment. And now, due to YouTube's community guidelines, I can't really say, what the police officers walked into, but luckily, Tali Shapiro was alive. And Rodney, he was nowhere to be found. He had fled California and moved across the country to New York City, where he went under the fake name Jake Berger. He enrolled at NYU's film school, and while he was playing the part of a quiet, artistic film student in New York, he continued preying on young women and girls. In 1971, 3 years after he fled California, he became a counselor at an art summer camp for children in New Hampshire, again under the fake name Jake Berger. Now, luckily, 2 campers who attended the summer camp had actually seen Rodney's face on an FBI Most Wanted poster and recognized him. The FBI was tipped off, and soon after, he was arrested. He was extradited back to California to finally face justice for what he did to Tali Shapiro. But Tali's family, of course, traumatized by what had happened, actually moved to Mexico and didn't want Tali to testify in court. Without Tali's testimony, prosecutors couldn't go after Rodney for the full extent of the charges. Rodney took a plea deal and served just 34 months behind bars. But by the time that Rodney was released from prison, it was like nothing had changed. Over the next several years, Rodney went on a terrifying murder spree. He would approach young women and girls in public places. He would, tell them he was a professional photographer and that he was building a portfolio for a contest. And, once he gained their trust, he would lure them into somewhere remote and would take pictures of them, and then he would torture and his victims. Between 1971 and 1979, bodies started turning up across California and later in other states as well. Most were young women, some as young as 12 or 13 years old. Now, what's especially disturbing is that Rodney kept trophies or items that he took from his victims after their deaths. He kept jewelry, ID cards, and of course, the photographs. And all the while, Rodney managed to live a double life. He held jobs, he dated women, and he appeared functional. No one had any idea that he was committing these crimes and getting away with it for years. Now, in the middle of Rodney's murder spree, literally while he was actively killing women, he somehow managed to land a spot on a popular TV show called The Dating Game. Basically, The Dating Game was a huge show back in the 1960s and 1970s. One woman would ask questions to 3 hidden male contestants and choose one to go on a date with. And in 1978, Bachelor number 1 was none other than Rodney Alcala. He walked on stage in a beige suit, all smiles and confidence, looking like any other smooth-talking guy trying to win a date. And the craziest part is that he actually won. The Bachelorette, Cheryl Bradshaw, chose him out of 3 contestants. She said he seemed fun and interesting, but after the show, Cheryl got a completely different vibe. She said in multiple interviews that the moment she was alone with Rodney off camera, she felt something was deeply wrong. She then described him as creepy, off-putting, and just gave off like serial killer vibes. Thankfully, her instincts kicked in and she refused to go on the date. Now let's take a listen to Daniel and Joe discuss the dating game killer.
Dude was a serial killer back in the 70s.
And he was on the dating game.
He was on how... Yeah. That's a bad person, knowing he's got that many bodies out there and he's on national television.
How many people had he killed before he got on the...
Bro, he killed a number. He killed a woman way back. Dude, could you imagine? Like growing up back, like being an adult in the 60s and 70s, nuts. There is no internet. There is no cell phones. Women that were out there in the world were at risk for serial killers because you couldn't track them. This woman and her husband, or boyfriend, had went up to like Montana. The boyfriend got mad at her, left her, just left her. This guy picks her up, kills her. They don't find her till like 2000, bro. And she was, when they found her, they found that she was pregnant at the time. He killed her, and then he killed a number of other ones, and then he went on the dating game show. He was a bad guy. And then...
So you can find that video.
Bro.
The guy on the dating game.
The dating game killer is what he was called.
I remember he looked real
He looked scary too, didn't he? And then, bro, look at him. Look at him. They caught him because he was trying to take a little girl from a school. Hey, Joe, and when they finally got this dude at the end, Joe, they met him in jail because he had been rotting in jail for years. Look at all these women he got. Look at all these women he got.
God.
He was just a bad guy. They said when they went to see this dude and he's on his, like he's dying in jail, and they start bringing up these women that they had found, they said it was almost like he was going to a place of euphoria. Because even though he was like on his deathbed and he couldn't move, he was thinking back to those times. That's a bad guy.
Oh my God.
He's like on the thing, like literally like losing his mind.
Oh my God.
Because he's thinking of killing this woman. Or like doing what he was doing to these ladies.
God.
It's nuts, bro. That's a bad guy.
1 year after Rodney's appearance on the dating game, a 12-year-old girl named Robin Samso went missing in Huntington Beach, California. She had been riding her bike to ballet class when she vanished. Her friends said a strange man had approached her and asked to take her picture. Her body was found 12 days later in the foothills of the Sierra Madre. The police got a break when someone gave them a sketch of the man who had been talking to Robin before she disappeared. That sketch matched a name they already knew: Rodney Alcala. When the police arrested him, they searched a storage locker that he had rented in Seattle, and what they found in that storage locker would become one of the biggest pieces of evidence in his whole entire case. Inside were hundreds of photographs of women, girls, and even young boys, most of them in provocative or disturbing poses, and some who have still never been identified to this day. In 1980, Rodney went to trial for the murder of Robin Samso, and he was convicted and sentenced to death, but the conviction was overturned. not once, but twice. In 1984, the California Supreme Court ruled that the jury had been unfairly influenced by learning about Rodney's previous sex crimes, so they tossed the conviction. He was tried again in 1986. He was found guilty again, but it was overturned, this time on a technicality involving the exclusion of a defense witness. But in the early 2000s, new DNA technology was finally catching up with old evidence. Samples from several unsolved murders, women who had been raped and killed in the 70s, were retested, and the DNA matched Rodney Alcala. In 2010, after decades of investigations, mistrials, and appeals, Rodney was put on trial again. But this time, the prosecutors had overwhelming forensic evidence. He was convicted of 5 counts of first-degree murder and sentenced to death for the third and final time. During the trial, Rodney chose to act as his own attorney. He spent hours playing strange, rambling monologues and even questioned himself on the stand. At one point, he played the role of both prosecutor and defense attorney, asking himself questions in a bizarre back and forth, changing his voice every time. And while on California's death row, Rodney died of a heart attack at a hospital in Kings County on July 24th, 2021 at the age of 77. Rest in piss. On the Joe Rogan Experience number 1459, featuring Tom O'Neill, Tom talks to Joe Rogan about the Tate murders and how the official narrative of the murders doesn't add up. But before we hear Tom O'Neill's take on the Tate murders, let's actually discuss what the Tate murders were. And to do that, we have to understand the man behind them. Charles Manson. Charles Manson was born in 1934, and his early life was rough from the start. He grew up bouncing around between relatives, juvenile detention centers, and eventually prison. He was in and out of the system for most of his life. By the time he was in his 30s, he had developed this mix of criminal instinct, manipulative charm, and deep resentment towards society. But what made Charles Manson truly dangerous was that he had this uncanny ability to control people. In the late 1960s, Manson moved to California and began gathering a group of followers who were mostly young, vulnerable women who were drifting through the hippie movement, searching for meaning, freedom, and, just a place to belong. He offered them all of that. A family, as he called it. They lived together on a remote property outside of Los Angeles known as Spawn Ranch. There, Manson used a mix of LSD, free love, isolation, and mind games to break people down and rebuild them into his loyal followers. To the outside world, they were just another hippie commune. But inside, things were dark. Manson believed in a twisted prophecy he called Helter Skelter. He was convinced that a massive race war was coming, and he believed it was his destiny to trigger it. He thought that by committing horrific murders and making it look like black people had done it, society would implode, and he and his followers would rise from the chaos as leaders of a new world. And his followers believed it. They believed it so much that they would literally kill for him. Now back to the Tate murders. On the night of August 8th, 1969, in the quiet upscale neighborhood of Benedict Canyon in Los Angeles, 4 of Charles Manson's loyal followers, Tex Watson, Susan Atkins, Patricia Krenwinkel, and Linda Kasabian piled into a car with a terrifying mission. Charles ordered them to, and I quote, "Go to that house where Terry Melcher used to live and kill everyone there." Now, here's the thing. Terry Melcher was a record producer who had once rejected Manson's music. That house at 10050 Celio Drive represented that rejection. But by this time, Melcher had moved out. The people living there now were Sharon Tate and her husband, filmmaker Roman Polanski. Polanski was out of the country working on a film, and Sharon, who was 8 months pregnant, was home with friends. In the house was, of course, Sharon Tate, Jay Sebring, Abigail Folger, Wojciech Frykowski, and Stephen Parent. And at around midnight, the Manson followers arrived at the house. Tex Watson climbed a telephone pole and cut the phone line to the house. Then they parked down the road and walked up the long driveway. Their first victim was Stephen Parent. He was just trying to leave the property after saying goodbye to the caretaker. Tex Watson shot him 4 times through his car window. Parent died instantly. Then the group entered the main house. The attackers bursted into the house armed with knives and a .22 caliber revolver. Tex Watson shouted, and I quote, "I am the devil and I'm here to do the devil's business." Jay Sebring tried to protect Sharon, but he was shot and stabbed multiple times. Abigail Folger managed to escape out the back, but Patricia Krenwinkel chased her down and stabbed her over 20 times. Wojciech Frykowski fought back even after being shot, but he was eventually stabbed 51 times. And Sharon Tate was stabbed 16 times, killing both her and her unborn son. Before the killers left, they used Sharon's blood to write the word pig on the front door. The entire attack lasted under an hour and 5 people were dead, one of them being just 18 years old and one of them being an unborn child. So now that we know what the Tate murders were, let's hear why Tom O'Neill believes that the official narrative of the Tate murders doesn't add up. Take a listen.
In a nutshell, Manson believed that there was going to be a race war, and he wanted to incite this race war because he had convinced his followers that through messages he received from the Beatles' White Album, from their lyrics, from biblical Old Testament prophecies, that he had been told that he was going to be the savior of the world. And once a race war started, he would hide his family in a bottomless pit in the desert. And when the race war ended, with the blacks winning, the blacks would be framed for murders. The Manson family would emerge and repopulate the planet with their perfect offspring and dominate the blacks.
This was Vince Bugliosi's narrative, or
there was talk of that. There was a philosophy of helter skelter at the Spahn Ranch, where they lived in '68 and '69, that Manson would discuss. But whether or not it was the motive for the murders is I raise serious questions about that in the book.
Manson would discuss it in that way, that there was going to be a race war and that they would emerge and then their offspring.
Yeah, except for the fact that what's questioned. So the way Bugliosi was able to convict Manson wasn't at the Tate house when the murders happened. He had, in the official story, dispatched Susan Atkins, Patricia Krenwinkel, Leslie Kasabian, and Tex Watson to the house, the former house of Terry Melcher. They didn't know who lived there, but just to kill everybody. And as Manson allegedly said, leave something witchy. He wanted it to look like blacks had killed these, all he knew was they were wealthy, beautiful whites. And he wanted to ignite the race war, because if the Panthers got blamed for these murders, then the police would crack down on them, they'd revolt, the revolution would happen, it would spread across the whole world, and then when it was over and the blacks had prevailed, they were too dumb, Manson believed, to be able to run the world. That's when he would come out with his followers of their hole in the desert and take over the planet. Now, Bugliosi said in interviews that I didn't have until after he and I stopped speaking, which was when he started threatening me with lawsuits and other things in the about 2006-07. I discovered 2 or 3 interviews he gave in the early 70s where he was asked if he believed that Manson really believed this craziness. And Bugliosi said, I don't think Charlie believed in it. He got his followers to, but he never believed in that. He was too smart. He was a con man. What the interviewers didn't ask him in the follow-up was, well, if he didn't believe it, why did he send his followers to kill these people the first night at the Tate house, the second night in Los Feliz, as upper middle class couple, the La Biancas? Then, what was the motive?
News of the Tate murders hit Los Angeles like an earthquake. Sharon Tate wasn't just any victim, she was famous. She was married to one of the most talked about directors in Hollywood. I mean, for days, the media swarmed the scene and speculated wildly. And one day later, another couple, Lino and Rosemary LaBianca, were found murdered in their Los Feliz home. The method was eerily similar. It was overkill. The victims were stabbed and there was writing in blood on the wall. Words like death to pigs and helter skelter. Now at this point, it was clear. I mean, Los Angeles had a serial killer, or killers that were on the loose. Los Angeles went into complete panic mode. Celebrities started buying guns and hiring private security. Homeowners installed alarms, floodlights, and even got guard dogs. Some people like Steve McQueen and Frank Sinatra reportedly left Los Angeles entirely. Rumors flew, no one felt safe, and anybody could be next. Meanwhile, the Manson family returned to the commune at Spahn Ranch like nothing happened. In the days and weeks after the Tate and La Bianca murders, the police in Los Angeles were, in full-blown panic. At first, they didn't realize the two crimes were connected. The Tate murders seemed like a party gone wrong, and the La Bianca murders looked like a targeted home invasion. Meanwhile, as the police were in massive confusion, Charles Manson and his followers were back at Spahn Ranch, taking LSD and acting like nothing had happened. Actually, on August 16th, 1969, Los Angeles County Sheriff's deputies raided Spahn Ranch, but not for murder. They were looking into stolen cars and auto theft. A few Manson family members were arrested, but they were released soon after due to a clerical error. But still, the raid put them on law enforcement's radar. A few months later, Susan Atkins, one of Manson's most loyal followers, was arrested on unrelated charges, and she started to brag about the Tate and La Bianca murders while she was in jail. She told cellmates that she was part of the group that killed Sharon Tate. Disturbingly, she also described how she tasted Sharon's blood. And one of her cellmates snitched her out, and suddenly detectives started to get the full picture. They realized that Charles Manson had sent his followers to commit the murders. He didn't, personally or I guess he didn't physically kill anyone, but he planned the attacks and he gave the orders and he selected the victims. Linda Kasabian, who had acted as a lookout during the murders, eventually flipped and became the star witness for the prosecution. She gave chilling first-hand details of what happened that night, and she never laid a hand on anyone, which is why she was granted immunity. By December of 1969, Manson, Watson, Atkins, Krenwinkel, and Van Houten were all arrested and charged with multiple counts of murder. So let's move real quickly into the Charles Manson family trial. The trial began in June of 1970 and would drag on for nearly a year. From the very beginning of the trial, Manson made it very clear that he had no interest in a fair trial. He showed up to court with an X carved on his forehead, claiming that the system had quote-unquote X'd him out. His followers soon copied him, and then later Manson turned the X into a swastika, which is a very interesting choice. Inside the courtroom, Manson would stare down the jury, he would interrupt proceedings with rants, and at one point he even lunged at the judge screaming, and I quote, "Someone should cut your head off." But the real weight of the case came from Linda Kasabian, the former Manson follower who had turned over to a state's witness. Over 18 days of testimony, she recounted the murders in detail, painting a picture of cold-blooded cases. People begging for their lives, killers laughing, and Manson pulling the strings from behind the scenes. The defense tried to argue that the women were acting independently and that Manson didn't tell them to kill, but the prosecution made it very clear that, yes, it's true, Manson never physically killed anybody, but he manipulated his followers into doing it for him. In January of 1971, Charles Manson, Susan Atkins, Patricia Krenwinkel, and Leslie Van Houten were found guilty of first-degree murder. And during the penalty phase, Manson shaved his head and eyebrows, and in his final statement, he said, and I quote, "You are all my children, I am the devil." All four were sentenced to death, but in 1972, the California Supreme Court overturned the death penalty, and their sentences were commuted to life in prison. So yeah, that's basically the gist of Charles Manson and the Tate murders. On the Joe Rogan Experience number 2319, featuring Akash Singh, Joe and Akash discuss Sheldon Johnson. And for those of you who do not know, Sheldon Johnson was a guest on the JRE podcast in February of 2024, and just a few months after literally sitting across the table from Joe Rogan, he ended up getting arrested for murder. Now, most of you guys probably already know the story, but I'd like to quickly take a look at who Sheldon Johnson actually is. He was born and raised in Harlem, New York, during a time when the streets were filled with poverty, drugs, and violence. His entire family tree had been in and out of prison. His father, his grandfather, himself, and even his son had all spent time behind bars. Sheldon explained how his father was deaf, and at an early age, his father, who was a drug dealer, would bring Sheldon along to drug deals to help communicate. And at around the age of 12, Sheldon had become a drug dealer himself, and that's when he started to really rack up some charges. He'd spend most of his teens in and out of Rikers Island prison. At the age of 21, Sheldon Johnson was released from prison, and this is when things went downhill fast. In 1999, Sheldon Johnson was arrested for 2 armed robberies and was sentenced to a maximum of 50 years for using a gun to rob several men who owed him money for drugs. But this time, his time in prison was different. Sheldon wanted to turn his life around. You know, he knew that he couldn't keep living his life in and out of prison. So Sheldon spent a few years educating himself inside a prison. He got into school, he got his GED, and then he also got his bachelor's degree in behavioral science. He started working in the law library and became very interested in case law. And shortly after, he began working with prisoners to help them get out of prison. Sheldon had become a role model inmate, and due to his good behavior, he was released from prison after serving 25 years of his 50-year sentence. It seemed as if Sheldon had really turned his life around. Upon getting released from prison, he started working for the Queen's Defenders, where he dedicated his time helping out troubled youth. He even was considering going to law school. And then on February 1st, 2024, he was a guest on the Joe Rogan Experience Podcast, where he talked to Joe about his troubled past and how he turned it all around in prison. 38 days after the airing of that podcast episode, Sheldon Johnson was arrested for murder, manslaughter, criminal possession of a weapon, and concealment of a human corpse for killing a man named Colin Small. Police were called to Colin's apartment after neighbors heard gunshots coming from inside the apartment. When police arrived, they discovered Sheldon at the apartment, along with a human arm, human legs, and a head with a gunshot wound stored in a freezer. Surveillance video also showed Sheldon entering and exiting the apartment building wearing different disguises, and at one point, he was even carrying a large blue bin, and inside that bin was the torso of Colin. So now that we know who Sheldon Johnson is and his story, let's take a listen to Joe and Akash discuss Sheldon Johnson. Take a listen.
They find people that are wrongfully convicted and help them get out. We've had a bunch of those guys come on the podcast, including one guy who came on who was actually guilty. He was guilty before, and we knew he was guilty, but he got 50 years.
Right.
And then he was talking about he turned his life around, and his, like, a month after he was on the podcast? How long was it after he was on the podcast? 2 months? Maybe 2 months? Cut some dude's head off.
Yeah.
And he was wearing a blonde wig, and homie didn't understand new HD security cameras. Like, this dude put a blonde wig on. They got crystal clear footage of him with his goatee on, wearing a blonde wig, carrying some dude's head.
How sold were you in the room with him? How good was he at selling himself as this reformed person?
Well, you know, what does it mean? Okay, so he didn't kill anybody in jail, and then he's out now, and he's got this new lease on life, and he's out, and he, you know, he's trying to do something different with his life. When you listen to his explanation of what happened, why he went to jail. So he was a drug dealer.
Right.
And he had gone to jail before, and some dude owed him money. Some dude, some drug deal, and the guy was like, fuck you. So he found the guy, and he pistol whipped him, and he robbed him.
Okay.
And he got 50 years for that.
Right.
And he was a habitual criminal, for sure. So should he have gotten 50 years for that? Well, I don't know. I mean, it seems like when he got out, he was kind of a bad guy.
Yeah,
but was that because he spent 25 fucking years in jail? Because he was 20. I think he did 25 years before they let 24 before they let him out, which is an insane amount of time to be locked up in a prison and then expect to acclimate. And
so you're saying, did prison make him much worse?
Did prison make him much worse? Because it certainly can with some people. Yeah. But we've had people on that were innocent, and prison made them amazing. I mean, something about like the constant studying and the accepting your situation in life, even though you were innocent. And then a lot of those guys got released, and it's crazy to see them like they lost 20 years of their life for something
Yeah.
that was bullshit, complete bullshit.
Yeah.
And then you find out that the cops and the prosecutors who were involved in their case had done that to many, many, many people. That's another thing that people need to take into consideration. How fucking dirty some people involved in prosecuting and convicting people are.
Yeah.
On the Joe Rogan Experience number 2280, featuring Peter Berg, Peter Berg talks to Joe Rogan about the Mountain Meadows Massacre. As always, let's talk about the Mountain Meadows Massacre. So to understand this event, let's talk about the tension that was boiling across the American frontier in 1857, specifically in Utah Territory. So at this time, the United States was still expanding westward, and many parts of the frontier were, lawless. The Utah Territory was a particularly unique case. It was governed not just by local officials, but by Brigham Young, who was the powerful leader of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Brigham Young had led thousands of Mormon followers west to escape persecution after the murder of their founding prophet, Joseph Smith, and years of violence in Missouri and Illinois. In Utah, the Mormons built their own cities. They formed their own militia, and they tried to create a religious theocracy isolated from the rest of the United States. But tensions with the federal government were rising fast. Washington, D.C. was getting nervous about Utah's growing independence. Rumors were spreading that the Mormons were defying federal law and refusing to recognize the authority of U.S. officials. President James Buchanan decided to act. He sent 2,500 federal troops to Utah in what became known as the Utah War, a standoff between the US government and Mormon leadership. And even though it wasn't a full-blown shooting war, the conflict created paranoia and fear in Mormon communities. Church leaders warned that outsiders were enemies and another mass persecution was coming, and that they needed to prepare for bloodshed. The paranoia was amplified by sermons from Mormon leaders who preached what was known as blood atonement, a controversial idea that some sins could only be forgiven through the shedding of blood. Combined with their belief that they were God's chosen people being targeted by a corrupt nation, the Mormons were, they were on edge. They were heavily armed, they were highly organized, and they were ready to defend what they believed was a holy society under siege. Now, in the summer of 1857, over 120 immigrants from Arkansas set out west toward California in search of a better life. They were known as the Fancher Party, named after their leader, Alexander Fancher. The Fancher Party was well supplied, they were experienced, and they were organized. The travelers were mostly families, many of them traveling in covered wagons, driving livestock and carrying supplies for the long journey ahead of them. As they moved through Utah Territory, they passed through towns controlled by Mormon settlers, and the reception was anything but friendly. Mormon communities were already on edge due to the Utah War, and now a large group of armed, well-fed, and Southern-ascented immigrants were traveling right through their land. It didn't help that many locals believed that the Fancher Party was hostile. Many Mormons in southern Utah claimed that the Fancher Party bragged about killing Joseph Smith, or that they planned to join the US troops being sent to Utah. Now, the Fancher Party felt this pressure, so they decided to camp at a quiet pasture called Mountain Meadows, which is located in present-day southern Utah. As they were camping out, local Mormon leaders and militia members were meeting in secret, trying to decide what to do with the Fancher Party. Some wanted to let the Fancher Party pass, while others believed that the group was a threat and that they should be eliminated. Now, on the morning of September 7th, 1957, as the Fancher Party was camping at Mountain Meadows, they were unaware that just over the nearby ridges, dozens of armed men had surrounded them. The men were mostly local Mormon militiamen, and they had disguised themselves as Native Americans, smearing their faces with paint and wearing makeshift Native attire. Their goal was to stage the attack to look like a Native American raid, deflecting blame and preserving the Mormon community's standing with outsiders. And just after dawn, shots rang out. The Fancher Party was ambushed without warning. Several men were killed in the initial gunfire, and panic erupted inside the camp. Women screamed, children ran for cover, and the survivors quickly formed a defensive circle using their wagons. Now, the attackers thought that the ambush would be swift, But it was far from that. The Fancher Party fought back fiercely, and what was supposed to be a quick slaughter turned into a multi-day siege. Meanwhile, back in the nearby towns like Cedar City, Mormon leaders were debating what to do. The attack had failed to finish the job, and now there were dozens of survivors who had seen too much. So a decision was made. The Fancher Party would have to be completely eliminated. To make the massacre seem merciful, a false offer of safe passage was created. The militiamen sent a messenger to the Fancher Party, claiming that they had negotiated a truce with the Native Americans. If the Fancher Party surrendered their weapons and agreed to be escorted out peacefully, their lives would be spared. And at this point, I mean, the Fancher Party was worn down and they were desperate and, they were out of options. So they agreed. And the Fancher Party began to lay down their weapons and got prepared to be escorted out of Mountain Meadows. The plan, as explained to the Fancher Party, was that the men would leave first, each with a Mormon escort. Behind them, the women and older children would follow in separate groups. Then the escort started. As the procession moved forward, there was this chilling silence, and then at a prearranged signal, the escorts turned on the Fancher Party. Each Mormon militiaman shot or stabbed the person they were walking beside. The men were the first to fall, then the women, and then the older children and the teenagers. It's said that around 120 people were murdered that day. And it's also said that 17 children, all of them being under the age of 7, were spared. So yeah, that's the Mountain Meadows Massacre, but let's hear Peter Berg talk to Joe Rogan about it. Take a listen.
And the Mountain Meadows Massacre, which was the event that we used as kind of our inciting incident for the first episode, which was a real massacre that the Mormons committed on a group of pioneers who were heading out west, or a Mormon militia with some Paiute Indians attacked and murdered about 140 men, women, and children. And we present that in the film, and we present Brigham Young in the film. And many Mormons, it's interesting to start reading all the debate about it, but a lot of Mormons were saying, yeah, this is exactly what happened, and this is a part of our history. And there were other Mormons, particularly the seniors in Salt Lake City, were saying, this is not what happened, this is not fair. But what I find interesting about the Mormon church and about kind of how we present it is I've had a lot of people come to me and go, dude, I never knew the Mormons were such savages.
So gangster.
They were fucking gangster. Brigham Young was, in my opinion, a gangster, a survivor, a warrior. And for anyone who follows Mormon history, they started in upstate New York with this young kid, Joseph Smith, who found these tablets and basically rewrote the Bible and started getting this following. And then they moved to Missouri and they got popular. And then there was an extermination order, and it was kill all the Mormons. So they fled to Illinois and tried to survive up there at this place called Nauvoo that was going to be their peaceful place to live. And Joseph Smith was murdered, and they were run out of Illinois. And Brigham Young led these dudes, men and women, on foot across the plains in the winter to Salt Lake Valley, which was this desolate wasteland. And he said, oh, we'll stay here. They'll never come for us here. And they started coming, and Brigham Young basically said, fuck it, we're not taking it anymore. He built his own army, the Nauvoo Legion, and he said, we're staying here, we won't mess with you, but if you come after us, we will fight. And that point, I think, is interesting, and I think Brigham Young, who survived longer than all of them, and if you go to Salt Lake City, he did a pretty good job, right? Like,
yeah,
that's a big city, man. And
it's a great city.
And I don't know. I respect the Mormon religion. I respect Brigham Young, and I feel like we make him look like a gangster in American Primeval. And I don't know. he's a survivor, and I respect that.
In the days immediately following the massacre at Mountain Meadows, the whole Utah frontier fell silent. Over 120 people had been slaughtered, and for a time, no one was held accountable. The Iron County militia, made up of local Mormon settlers, worked quickly to hide their involvement. They blamed the massacre entirely on the Native Americans, claiming that the Mormon settlers had merely arrived too late to intervene, which, I mean, of course, was a huge lie, and it was a lie that many in the community knew. Now, the massacre site itself was neglected. I mean, bones and personal belongings just, laid scattered for years. As federal troops and new government officials began to regain influence in Utah after the Utah War, pressure grew for answers. But still, the Mormon leadership, including Brigham Young, denied prior knowledge or involvement. Young claimed that he hadn't heard about the massacre until weeks after it occurred. He also insisted that local leaders acted independently without his orders. But that claim is heavily debated, heavily debated. In 1874, an official investigation was launched, and the man who became the face of the crime was John D. Lee. Lee had been a prominent figure in Mormon society, a church elder, a militia officer, and even an adopted son of Brigham Young through the Mormon practice of spiritual sealing. But when it came time to assign blame, he was the one the church allowed to fall. He was arrested, tried, and charged with murder and conspiracy for his role in orchestrating the attack and personally leading the Fancher party to their deaths under false pretenses. His first trial in 1875 ended in a hung jury. His second trial, a year later, resulted in a conviction. On March 23, 1877, John D. Lee was taken back to Mountain Meadows, the site of the massacre. There, in front of a firing squad, he was executed. His final words were defiant. He claimed that he was a scapegoat, sacrificed in a cowardly, dastardly manner, is what he said. Lee was likely not the only one responsible and certainly not the highest ranking, but his death brought the government what it wanted: closure and the appearance of justice. No one else was ever prosecuted. No senior church leaders were held legally accountable. Brigham Young, who had, denied advanced knowledge, died just a few months after Lee's execution, still a revered and powerful figure in Mormon history. For a long time, the Mountain Meadows Massacre remained a taboo subject. I mean, it was rarely spoken of openly with the, LDS church. But over the years, pressure from descendants, historians, and the public forced a slow acknowledgement. In 1999, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints erected a memorial at the massacre site, basically just a place to honor the dead, including the women and children who were betrayed and killed. In 2007, on the 150th anniversary, the church formally expressed profound regret for the massacre. These have been 4 of the craziest true crime stories ever told on the Joe Rogan Experience Podcast. Now, if you guys enjoyed, please be sure to subscribe with those post notifications on, as it significantly helps out the channel. Also, make sure to leave a comment down below what story or, which true crime case you found the craziest or the most profound, if you will. And without further ado, folks, I hope you guys have a great rest of your day. Stay safe. Peace out.